Hello, welcome to Some Notes on Style. I'm your host Joseph. This week we're going to take a look at pattern mixing in tailored clothing. We'll use the fundamentals for a tried and true framework as to how to get a little experimental by first knowing your basics. And we're also going to be using as a guide the Gentleman's True Holy Bible of classic style standards, the book Dressing the Man, Mastering the Art of Permanent Fashion by Alan Flusser. This was a book I picked up when I used to design at Ralph Lauren. It wasn't necessarily referenced as much internally, but a lot of the lessons Flusser teaches would certainly be thought of as a type of required reading nonetheless. If any of you all are unfamiliar with Flusser, he's a New York tailoring legend who still maintains a very small list of private clients to this day. However, his heyday was in the mid-1980s when he was doing work for the real masters of the universe, ultimately culminating in dressing the fictionalized versions of them in the 1987 film Wall Street, played by Michael Douglas. That horizontal striped banker's shirt has always been a true signature of his. And the book does a wonderful job of illustrating some of the classic standards within menswear and how they can be applied to a wide range of primarily formal tailored clothing outfits. So we're going to jump on over to chapter 4, the prerogatives of pattern, and follow the same format as he does in our examples today. And real quick before we get started, two additional caveats. Number one, in order to avoid any distractions, I'm going to be mostly distilling down these examples in combinations primarily revolving around navy and white with little touches of gray, so that way the pattern combos will remain the central focus and will not allow color to factor into the outcome of these scenarios. There might occasionally be a few breaks of color here or there because although my personal collection is quite extensive, it's not infinite, so I do have to sometimes throw in things just as a matter of necessity in order to illustrate the point. And that leads me to point number 2. A lot of these examples of shirts I will be showing today will have cutaway collars. Now, I realize cutaway collars might be a bit controversial. People either love them or hate them, but most of my collection was gathered from my time working at Ralph Lauren Purple Label. At the time I was there, Ralph was really into English cutaway collars across the board. We cut them into a model called the Keaton collar. Why Keaton, you may ask? Well, if I remember correctly, I believe it was a reference to silent film star Buster Keaton, who had a very distinctive comedic detached wingtip collar through a great deal of his films, in which his clip-on necktie would become incredibly visible front and center. But the more I think about it, this actually has very little relevance to what the end result of the Keaton collar actually became. Perhaps a more accurate reference would have been to base it on another silent film star and my personal favorite, Harold Lloyd, who, as we see in some of these examples, actually wore collars from time to time much closer to the end result of the cutaway collar style that we ran in Purple Label. Maybe the Lloyd shirt just didn't have the same kind of ring to it. But anyway, if you're a fan of the cutaway collar, a lot of these are Keaton collar shirts. But seeing as how they're not run very frequently by Ralph these days, and if they are, they range in price from $495 all the way up to $695. At the end of the video, I'll give you guys a couple more affordable brands that run this style of collar, although it's a pretty rare item to find out and about in general. For me, it was that rareness that was part of the attraction when I was working in New York, circles of guys who were regularly wearing a great deal of tailored clothing. The distinctiveness of this collar shape really seemed to be a nice point of difference, something I enjoyed as being a little unique. However, these days, with fewer and fewer guys wearing tailored clothes and the fact that I live in a more suburban area where nobody is wearing tailored clothing, wearing something this exaggerated and extreme feels really out of place, so I don't get much use for these collars that much these days. But either way, this is where the majority of my dress shirt collection came from, so you'll see a lot of examples of Keaton collars and some upcoming mannequins nonetheless. With all that being said, back to the dressing the man and the prerogative of patterns. So to start out speaking generally about patterns, most of what we can attribute to modern day pattern mixing, like so many other things, he associates with the Duke of Windsor and the 1920s. So obviously Victorian fashion was transitioning out of favor, and the stiff and staid, very staunchy traditional faceless morning suit attire no longer held its appeal to a younger generation. They were transitioning their clothes in the early form of modern day sportswear in a collection of sack suits and pieces acquired from a number of worldly sources, and joyfully experimenting in mixing and matching elements of your outfit as opposed to strictly adhering to the Victorian custom of the same uniform. And no surprise that the Prince of Wales, as an international icon of style, represented a gentleman who could flamboyantly style out his day-to-day looks in a range of textures and patterns as a means of personal expression. and he did so quite masterfully all throughout his life, not to mention setting the tone for a lot of the standards that would go into set in as what defined a gentleman's wardrobe. So obviously the Duke of Windsor and his personal taste provide a masterclass in everything that we begin to think of when we try to define the next 100 years of men's style and what it was to be, but that really can be a huge rabbit hole. So let's just safely say, if you want a deep dive, treat him as your white rabbit and you may never look at your closet the same way again. But let's start with the basics, starting with number 1, mixing two patterns of the same design. In this first example, starting with a fine pinstripe wool suit in a wider space stripe, we can accent that with a Bengal stripe shirt in blue and white with a finer, even, bolder stripe. The difference in scale provides a harmonious balance, and the solid necktie provides a moment of visual rest. In the next example, here we've got a solid navy blazer and concentrate the contrast and stripes in the shirt and necktie combination. Here's a blue ground shirt with a white stripe, overall a very fine stripe visually, and that can be paired with a fine stripe in the necktie with the more exaggerated spacing for a bit of visual contrast, so that if your eyes are blurred, there are two clear differences in the scales of the stripes. Next look, same principle with a more bold and graphic version. Here, a chunkier blue and white Bengal stripe is paired with a more traditional silk rep tie in green, navy, and gold. Yes, a little color helps here, but generally the idea of the variations in stripes with a larger scale against a finer scale allows for a balance of stripe-on-stripe action, regardless of the color. And finally, next example, a tighter, more pronounced pinstripe three-piece suit paired against a gray and white Bengal stripe with a solid necktie. This example is similar to the first in that you've got a striped suiting and a stripe in the shirt, but here you can see that when the scales of the stripes come a little closer together, the final effect can cause your eyes to dance around a little bit more. But there is still a distinction between the scales, and the necktie provides a calmer central focus. Granted, I did cheat a little bit here because there is a small texture on this necktie. A completely solid necktie might help to solidify that focal point a little bit better. Number 2, matching two checks. So here's an example moving into a different motif from stripes, one that provides its own set of challenges. In this case, I got a double-breasted wool Glen plaid flannel suit, which actually has a nice faint blue overcheck within its patterning. So to play off that blue, I paired it with a solid blue dress shirt, and to mimic that same blue within the wool necktie. Now, something that helps tremendously is the overall coloring of the Glen plaid, and the necktie is obviously considerably darker, lending itself to an instant contrast. But probably more importantly, there is also careful study in scales, with the Glen plaid the necktie being considerably larger scale than the tighter check in the suit. But with the very nature of checks being a lot more visually jarring, this is certainly a very tricky game. Number 3, matching two different patterns. So in the first example, here I got a Glen plaid against a bolder Bengal striped shirt. Now, same trick applies, again with solid colored necktie acting as a central calming focus, but what's working here successfully is the boldness of the stripe in the shirt, because within the plaid there are a lot of finer stripes crisscrossing over one another, and it becomes quite difficult to pair a Glen plaid with a very fine stripe, or else you'll quickly give anyone looking at you a headache. So in order to avoid that, in this case, we've paired bold against fine for a more balanced outcome. Here, the next example, a similar situation with a different pattern. Same shirt and tie, this time with a fine houndstooth check in the jacket. The navy and blue tonality within the houndstooth also helps to calm down the overall appearance, giving a little more sophisticated and subtle pairing. This is also an example of how the same effect can be applied using a lighter weight material for the upcoming spring season by switching out your flannels for your linens, but using the same tricks. Next example has two different motifs, essentially both laid out in a grid formation, with the evenly spaced checks forming a gingham style in the shirt and a repeating crest motif in the necktie. Once again, utilizing scale, not just in the spacing of the two patterns, but also within the scale of the crest and the necktie being proportionally larger than the checks in the shirt, helping to push and pull the two away from each other. And of course, pairing all this underneath a solid colored jacket or suit brings a lot of the attention to the shirt and necktie combination. Then for the next look, somewhat smarter and more formal pairing, the classic stripe and polka dot. With this combo, you got a couple of interesting things going on. It just so happens that because you have a stripe and a dot, Both sharing a highlight color of white, the contrasting collar also gets in on the action by helping to bridge these two patterns together, pulling that white in harmoniously into a sense of balance. And the subtle trick of a white linen pocket square carries that outward across the full width of the chest. Stripes and dots always seem to play nicely off of one another, and as a motif never seem to go out of style. Number 4, mixing 3 patterns. Okay, really upping the ante here. Admittedly, I made a little bit of a mistake here. I couldn't help myself and I just went right into that 4th pattern in the pocket square, so please try to bear with me. The general idea still remains the same though. In this case, we've got 3 different motifs with a striped herringbone and a repeating evenly spaced paisley in the necktie. But again, paying attention to scale, utilizing repeating color in both the stripe and the herringbone, paying attention to the differentiation between the finer and the wider herringbone, and of course a helpful balance of scale and the necktie motif against the finer, even stripe of the shirt. All the same lessons continue to come into play. Something I noticed in doing this is that tweed helps considerably when looking for a pattern to jump off from. I'm especially thinking of something like a herringbone, which even though it has a lot of movement in the pattern, has a relatively even repetition in its weave, which can be a little less visually jarring than something like a Glen plaid or a houndstooth. Number 5, mixing 3 patterns when 2 are the same. This is a helpful play when you start to get into the 3 pattern game because instantly pairing 2 of the patterns closer together, at least being similar in the same motif, picking a third as a point of difference helps to leverage that offset into something a little more visually striking. The 2 similar patterns almost act as a foundation in that they can come together in their similarity, allowing for the third to be showcased a little more strongly. In this case, the bold chalk stripe suit and the evenly striped Bengal shirt allow the repeating motif and the necktie to have more of a moment. Something that helps here as well is the spacing of the crests provides a lot of room for that navy ground to help calm the eye after moving on from something as dynamic as those heavy chalk stripes. In this case, the chalk stripes set the stage for such a dramatic framing that a little more high contrast shirt and tie feels right at home. Then for the next example, a familiar setup of the tighter space pinstripe gray suit and that gray and white Bengal striped shirt from before, in this case offsets that stripe on stripe with a Glen plaid in the necktie. With this combo, you got a lot of directional lines going every which way, but with the Glen plaid being cut on the diagonal on the bias, it helps to move the eye around the verticals of the striped suit, creating a harmonious circular pathway for the eye to move when viewing this outfit. And although I tried to keep the colors relatively monotone for all these looks for the sake of illustration, I feel like it really helps an outfit like this to prevent the patterns from being overwhelmed by color. Number 6, mixing 3 patterns of the same design. Scale, scale, scale is the name of the game here. Obviously, we will no longer be able to utilize color or pattern in order to differentiate the elements here. The only thing to fall back on is scale. Now I realize as I'm saying this happens to be a shielded green rep stripe necktie against a blue and white Bengal stripe and the navy and white pinstripe suit, but I think the same technique can easily be made with a navy and white necktie with the same scales and motifs applied. In this instance, again, the spacing differentiation of the stripes between the suit and the shirt provide a clear, distinct point of difference with the exploded scale of the stripe and the necktie, helping to jump away from the foundation of the shirt and the jacket. Number 7, mixing 4 patterns. Okay, we've reached the end of the line. At this point, you're either reached a level of mastery or you're completely insane. Because once you get into 4 pattern territory, you really got to know what you're doing or absolutely not give a damn. And luckily, when it comes to tailored clothing, the real secret weapon here is, of course, the pocket square. Because if you can master 3 patterns in your shirt, necktie, and jacket, adding the subtle detail of a 4th in your pocket square really seems like a no-brainer. Of course, that's not just a given, because in this first example, bringing in small amounts of color helps considerably as well. Obviously still maintaining with the primary focus in navy, white, and gray, bringing in subtle accents of a deep red and a few subtle earth tones can really inform that pocket square choice, but it's not essential. Sometimes I think when you start to get into this many patterns, sometimes the overall look can feel a little outdated. Because generally when we see tailored clothing these days, being interpreted as modern usually runs parallel with having a more limited color palette. And when we start getting into these more antiquated motifs, it can start to feel a little costumey if you're not careful. But nonetheless, once again utilizing the same tricks here, we see in the necktie and the jacket falling together a little more succinctly, and the bold blue and white stripe of the shirt actually jumps away from the rest of the look a little more. So that kind of seems to be the running theme here, is just pick the bold item and let the other 2 or 3 dissipate into the background. Here's another example going back to the double-breasted Glen plaid. Here's a pronounced white herringbone rep striped tie. It jumps away from the very fine micro check in the shirt. These little micro patterns in shirts are also a nice trick when looking to mix and match. The fineness of their scale obviously reads almost as a solid, so it's a nice way of slipping in a pattern which does not compete for attention. In this case, the scale of that gingham almost picks up on the ground striping within the Glen plaid, which surprisingly levels the whole thing out. And then getting in that extra fourth with the polka dot pocket square, which thanks to its spacing and graphic color play gives a bold necktie a nice balance. And finally, something a little more traditional and familiar. With each element rooting itself in traditional Ivy League style, I tried to pull this look together to illustrate that sometimes within Ivy style, these quite advanced style moves can be made just by nature of the traditional pieces themselves. In other words, a herringbone jacket, Bengal stripe Oxford shirt, crested necktie, these are all things that we're quite familiar with. So sometimes when mixing and matching these items that are incredibly familiar, the novelty of mixing 4 patterns on top of one another somehow seems incredibly natural. Even if we see that the overall look that may not seem like much, if you look closely, there's a lot of attention being paid to ensure a successful outcome. Okay, so that's going to wrap us up this week, guys. 1, 2, 3, 4 patterns. How many do you guys find most comfortable? I tend to ride a 2 or 3 myself. Obviously, all of these looks are punctuated with a necktie and pocket square, so in all reality, most of us on most days might just be getting dressed up to put a jacket on over a shirt. So there's a lot of fun to be had in just mixing and matching our shirts and our jackets alone without having to get too worried about all the accessories. Oh, I almost forgot about those cutaway collar shirts. If any of y'all are fans of those, of course you could probably still try to find some old Ralph Lauren purple label Keaton collars on eBay, but even those things can still run a couple of $100. Now, I've seen them for sale at a company that admittedly advertises on Instagram, so no promises here, called Brisk Shirts. Their quality does not look so good, but they sell them at around $50. So one of these days I've been meaning to give them a try. But they offer both a cutaway and an extreme cutaway, which can be a little bit too extreme for good taste. But the cutaways look okay if you're conscious of your fabric selection, which also seems like a bit of a minefield with this company because some fabrics look like they're trying too hard to be something fancier than they are. Then another affordable company I've seen that does these cutaways is called Dandy & Son. They come in a little closer, around $100. I bought 1 or 2 of them from them, and the quality is all right. I mean, obviously compared to a $600 Ralph Lauren purple label shirt, it's not quite the same, but they use a relatively lightweight shirting with an acceptable stitch quality. I think most of what you'd be paying for with this company is the novelty of that collar, which like I said is quite difficult to find otherwise. But between these 2 companies, Dandy & Son is the only one I've personally tried, so I can somewhat recommend them if you really need to get that cutaway fix. And be sure and let me know if you all are enjoying this topic, or if you'd like to see more with regard to shirts and neckties, or if you're enjoying the pattern mixing. I'd be happy to follow this episode up with a part 2 that injects a little more color into the mix, which might be pretty applicable to the upcoming spring season. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys think. And as always, if you're enjoying the video, please give me that thumbs up. And if you're enjoying the channel, click that subscribe button if you haven't already. And if you'd like to help support the channel a little more, click on the link in the description down below, head on over to Patreon and become a distinguished gentleman, get the monthly Some Notes on Style newsletter, as well as all the back issues of previous months, where I compile all the corresponding tear sheet imagery for each episode's topic directly to you in your mailbox. Or if you just enjoyed watching the video and you made it this far, I appreciate that too. Once again, the channel is Some Notes on Style. I'm your host, Joseph. See you again next time, guys. Bye.